It was a perfect Saturday afternoon at Oak Ridge Park. The sun cast a warm glow over the sprawling fields, where families had set up picnic blankets, and children's laughter filled the air. Dogs barked playfully, chasing after frisbees, while the smell of grilled hot dogs and burgers wafted from a nearby food truck. It was the kind of day that Dr. James Harris cherished an escape from the intensity of the hospital, where he spent most of his time as a surgeon. This day was special. It was one of those rare moments he got to spend with his son, Malcolm, without worrying about surgeries, emergencies, or pagers buzzing nonstop. James, a 38-year-old black man with a calm, commanding presence, held his son's hand as they approached the playground. He was dressed casually in a gray hoodie and jeans, blending in with the other parents, though his fit frame and measured steps gave him an air of authority. Malcolm, just 6 years old, had a head full of curly hair and wore a bright red t-shirt that seemed to glow in the sunlight. His excitement was contagious as he pulled his father toward the swings, his feet barely touching the ground in his eagerness to start playing. "Daddy, push me higher," Malcolm shouted, his laughter ringing out as he pumped his legs in the air. "All right, little man, but not too high, or you'll touch the clouds," James teased, his deep voice filled with warmth. As they played, the world around them seemed to slow down. For James, these moments were rare treasures, time to bond with Malcolm and forget, even for a short while, about the harsh realities outside the park. But even in the midst of this joy, there was always a part of him that remained vigilant, aware that the world didn't always afford him the same carefree attitude as the other families around him. He'd worked hard to build his career and provide a stable life for Malcolm, but experience had taught him that success didn't erase how people sometimes saw him, first a black man. On a nearby bench, Amelia Pearson sat, sipping iced tea, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head. At 45, Amelia was an influential member of the local community. She was the type who organized neighborhood fundraisers, led parent-teacher meetings, and was known to keep an eye out in the area. Dressed in a light blue blouse and crisp white slacks, with her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, she looked like she belonged in a catalog for suburban living. She had seen James and Malcolm when they first arrived at the park, and at first she thought nothing of it. Just another dad with his kids, she figured. But as time passed, something gnawed at her. There was something about the man, his skin, the fact that the child with him didn't look exactly like him, that made her uneasy. She told herself she was just being cautious. After all, it was her responsibility, wasn't it? To make sure everything was safe in her neighborhood? Does that child even belong to him, she wondered, her eyes narrowing as she watched them. James lifted Malcolm onto his shoulders, and the boy squealed in delight. He ran toward the jungle gym, holding tightly onto his dad's head, and James let out a hearty laugh as he jogged behind him. This sight should have brought a smile to anyone watching, anyone who saw the clear, loving bond between father and son. But Amelia's thoughts twisted the scene into something darker. "That doesn't look right," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head slightly. "I've never seen them around here before." Her heart rate quickened slightly, and the iced tea in her hand began to feel heavier. She wasn't the type to be overtly confrontational, but she believed in keeping things orderly. This was her community, her safe space. And something about this situation just didn't feel safe. Her dog, a tiny white Maltese named Baxter, tugged at the leash, breaking her concentration. But even as she petted the dog to calm herself, Amelia's eyes flicked back to the playground, her thoughts clouded by a nagging sense of duty. She was sure she had to do something. But what? A few minutes later, Malcolm ran toward the monkey bars, his curly hair bouncing with every step. He looked back at James, his face gleaming with excitement. "Watch me, Daddy. I'm gonna do it." James smiled, standing a few feet away. "I'm watching, champ. You got this." But just as Malcolm reached for the first bar, his foot caught on the edge of the platform, and he tumbled down, hitting the ground hard. The thud echoed louder in James' ears than it did in reality. James dashed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached his son in seconds, scooping him up into his arms with the steady hands of someone who'd treated hundreds of injuries, but with the trembling heart of a concerned father. "Are you okay, buddy?" His voice was calm, though worry lined his face. Malcolm sniffled, more shaken than hurt. "I fell, Daddy." James checked his son over carefully. "You're all right, just a little bump." But no more jungle gym today. Okay. From her bench, Amelia's eyes widened as she watched the scene unfold. To her, the image wasn't that of a father comforting his child, it was something far more sinister. In her mind, James' quick reaction looked like panic, like he had something to hide. And Malcolm's tears, which were simply the result of a harmless fall, appeared to her as a sign of distress. Her hand hovered over her phone, hesitating for just a moment. Maybe I should call. Just to be safe, she thought, her fingers trembling as they brushed the screen. What if that man isn't supposed to be with that child? Finally, her fear got the better of her and she dialed 911. "Hello, I'd like to report something suspicious at the park," she said, her voice low but urgent. "There's a man here with a little boy and I don't think the boy is safe." James sat with Malcolm on a bench by the playground, gently wiping away the last of his son's tears with a tissue. The small bump on Malcolm's knee had already faded, but the emotional sting of the fall lingered. As he comforted his son, the world around them continued as if nothing had happened. The other children kept playing, dogs barked in the distance, and parents chatted amongst themselves. James glanced around, noticing how peaceful it seemed again. He was just beginning to relax when he saw the unmistakable flashing lights of a police car pulling into the park. At first, he didn't connect the arrival of the police with him. He kept his attention on Malcolm, offering reassuring words as the little boy began to perk up. But the police car stopped not far from where they were sitting, and two uniformed officers stepped out. Their eyes immediately locked onto James, and in that moment, a familiar chill ran down his spine. He'd experienced this kind of attention before. He knew what was coming. The officers moved toward him with purpose. One, a tall man with a shaved head and sharp features, placed a hand on his belt, near his holstered gun. The other, shorter and younger, seemed less sure of himself but followed closely behind. James could feel Malcolm stiffen next to him, sensing the sudden tension. "Daddy, who are they?" Malcolm whispered, his small hand gripping his father's shirt tightly. James swallowed the tightness forming in his throat, forcing himself to remain calm for his son's sake. "It's okay, buddy. Just stay close to me, all right?" He gave Malcolm a reassuring squeeze before standing up slowly, raising his hand slightly in a gesture meant to calm the situation before it escalated. The lead officer, whose name tag read Officer Williams, was the first to speak. "Sir, we received a call about some suspicious activity involving a child. We need to ask you a few questions." James's heart sank. He kept his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "I'm not sure what this is about, officer. My son and I were just playing here at the park." Officer Williams gave a curt nod, but his eyes scanned the scene, clearly still suspicious. "Can you show us some identification, sir?" Malcolm tugged at his father's arm, fear creeping into his voice. "Daddy, what's happening?" "It's all right, Malcolm," James said softly, trying to project an air of calm, even though he felt anything but. He slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and careful. Years of experience had taught him to be cautious in these situations, no matter how innocent he knew himself to be. He handed over his ID to Officer Williams, who inspected it closely before passing it to his partner, Officer Mitchell. James kept his eyes on Malcolm, crouching down to his son's level. "Stay right here, okay? I need you to be brave for me." Malcolm nodded, but James could feel his son's fear. It broke his heart to see his child experience something like this, something no child should have to understand. As Officer Mitchell stepped away to radio in the details, Officer Williams remained, his posture rigid, clearly not convinced by James's explanation. "So this is your son?" he asked, his tone neutral but tinged with an undercurrent of doubt. "Yes, he's my son," James replied firmly. "We live just a few blocks away. We come to this park often." Before Officer Williams could respond, a woman's voice interrupted. "That's him," Amelia called from her bench, her voice filled with what she believed to be righteous concern. She had approached the scene, standing a few feet behind the officers, her expression a mix of worry and misplaced certainty. "I saw the whole thing. The little boy looked scared. He fell and I thought something was wrong." James turned toward her, his face tight with frustration, but he kept his composure. "He's not scared of me. He tripped on the playground. It's not uncommon for kids to fall." But Amelia, caught up in her own assumptions, continued. I didn't want to take any chances. I've never seen you two here before, and with everything you hear on the news these days, you can't be too careful." She seemed to be addressing the officers more than James, as if she expected them to back her up. She thought she was doing the right thing, protecting a child who might be in danger. Her biases blinded her to the obvious, the loving father comforting his child right in front of her. The tension in the air thickened as more parkgoers began to notice the unfolding situation. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones, recording the scene from a distance. Officer Williams remained stoic, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe doubt, or perhaps just the weight of yet another situation spiraling out of control. "Sir, we just need to verify everything," he said, more softly this time. "We're just doing our job." James took a deep breath, nodding, though every fiber of his being wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. He was tired of the assumptions, tired of always having to prove himself, tired of trying to shield Malcolm from the harsh realities of a world that viewed him with suspicion simply because of the color of his skin. Malcolm tugged at his shirt again. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" James knelt down again, placing a hand on his son's small shoulder. "Yes, we're going to be fine. Just stay with me, all right?" Officer Mitchell returned, nodding slightly to Officer Williams. "His Idaho checks out," he said quietly. "No warrants, no issues." There was a brief moment of awkward silence. Officer Williams handed back the ID, his expression softening just a little. "Thank you for your cooperation, Dr. Harris," he said, finally using James's title. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Amelia stood frozen, her hands still holding onto Baxter's leash. She hadn't realized who James was, a respected surgeon, a man who had saved lives. In her mind, he had been just another stranger, a black man with a child, and her own biases had filled in the rest. Now that certainty began to crumble. I didn't know," she mumbled, her voice suddenly small and unsure. "I thought." James didn't look at her. He was focused entirely on Malcolm, lifting his son into his arms and holding him close. "Let's go home, buddy," he whispered, turning to leave without acknowledging the officers or Amelia again. As they walked away, Amelia stood rooted in place, watching them. Her heart raced as guilt and shame began to settle in. She had called the police on a father who was simply playing with his child, and now she was starting to realize just how wrong she had been. But the damage was already done. The walk home was silent, except for the soft shuffle of Malcolm's sneakers against the sidewalk. James held his son's hand tightly, his mind still spinning from the encounter at the park. He could feel Malcolm's confusion lingering in the air, the questions he hadn't yet asked bubbling just beneath the surface. James wasn't ready to answer those questions, not now, not yet. How could he explain to his 6-year-old that sometimes, no matter how successful or good you are, people will still see you as a threat simply because of the color of your skin? As they reached the front door of their modest home, Malcolm finally broke the silence. "Daddy, why did the police come? Did we do something bad?" James felt a lump form in his throat. He crouched down to Malcolm's eye level, resting a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "No, buddy, we didn't do anything bad," he said softly. "Sometimes people make mistakes. They think something is wrong when it isn't." Malcolm's big brown eyes searched his father's face, still not quite understanding. "But why?" James paused, struggling to find the right words. How do you tell your child that the world isn't always fair? How do you prepare him for the moments in life when the weight of his skin color will feel heavier than anything else? "It's complicated," James said finally. "But you don't need to worry. You're safe. I'll always make sure of that." Malcolm nodded, accepting his father's words for now. But James could see the seed of doubt had been planted, small, but present. He knew that in the years to come that seed would grow. He hated that his son would have to learn these lessons at such a young age, but he also knew it was unavoidable. The world wouldn't wait. Once inside, James helped Malcolm change out of his play clothes and settled down in front of the TV for his favorite cartoons. Normally they would laugh together, maybe make popcorn and enjoy a carefree afternoon. But today, James felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the anger at the situation, at the woman in the park, at the officers who hadn't even tried to consider another explanation. He stared out the window, the events replaying in his mind, trying to hold back the frustration that gnawed at him. Being a surgeon had afforded him a good life, a respected life. But moments like today were stark reminders that, To some, no amount of success would erase the fact that he was still seen as other. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his hospital colleague, Dr. Emily Watkins, another surgeon and one of his closest friends. Emily. Hey James, heard about what happened at the park. You good? James stared at the message for a moment. Word traveled fast, apparently. Someone from the park must have recognized him and spread the word at the hospital. He sighed and typed back. James. Yeah, I'm fine. Just one of those days. Emily responded almost immediately. Emily. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You know, if you need to talk, I'm here. James appreciated the support, but talking wasn't going to fix things. He wanted to move on, but he knew this wasn't something he could just forget. He glanced at Malcolm, who was now absorbed in his cartoons, giggling at something on the screen. At least for now, his son could hold on to his innocence. Meanwhile, across town, Amelia sat in her spacious kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling of guilt that had settled over her ever since the officers had left the park. She had acted on instinct, hadn't she? She was just trying to protect that little boy. But as the hours passed, she realized how deeply wrong she had been. Amelia had never thought of herself as someone who harbored prejudice. She supported charitable causes, donated to programs for underprivileged children, and even volunteered at a local community center. She believed herself to be open-minded and fair. Yet today she had made a snap judgment about a father who had done nothing but play with his son at the park. Her mind kept replaying the scene over and over again. The way the officers had arrived, their questioning the little boy's scared face as he clung to his father. She winced at the memory. She had caused that. She had been the reason those officers were there. She reached for her phone, almost dialing the number for a friend, but stopped herself. What would she even say? How could she explain what she had done? The shame burned hot in her chest. Her husband, Tom, walked into the kitchen, pulling her from her thoughts. You've been quiet all day. Everything all right? He asked, giving her a curious look as he poured himself a glass of water. Amelia hesitated. Tom didn't know about what had happened at the park. She hadn't told him. Part of her didn't want to admit it out loud, as if that would make it even more real. There was an incident at the park earlier, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom raised an eyebrow. What kind of incident? I called the police on someone, she admitted, her words tumbling out awkwardly. I thought there was something wrong, but I was wrong. Tom leaned against the counter, frowning. What do you mean? What happened? Amelia explained the scene as best she could, trying to make sense of her own actions as she spoke. She told him about the man and his son, the fall on the playground, and how she had let her assumptions get the better of her. I didn't realize. He's a surgeon, Tom. I didn't know. I saw something, and I thought the worst. Tom listened quietly, but his frown deepened. A surgeon? So the police came for nothing. Amelia nodded miserably. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought I was helping. Tom let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. You've got to be careful with that, Amelia. You can't just assume things about people. I know, she whispered, her voice cracking. But it's not just that. I can't stop thinking about how scared that little boy was. I did that. I caused that. For the first time, Amelia was truly facing the consequences of her actions. She had always believed herself to be the kind of person who stood on the right side of things, but today had shown her that even good intentions could be rooted in harmful bias. She didn't know how to make it right, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. She pushed her mug aside and stood up abruptly. I need to do something, she said, more to herself than to Tom. What are you going to do? Tom asked, watching her with concern. I don't know yet, she admitted, her heart heavy. But I need to fix this. The next morning, James found himself sitting at the breakfast table sipping his coffee, his mind still heavy with the events of the previous day. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clinking of Malcolm's spoon as he stirred his cereal absent-mindedly. James glanced at his son, who seemed quieter than usual, the brightness in his eyes dulled by the confusion that lingered from the park incident. Daddy, Malcolm finally said, breaking the silence. Are the police going to come again? James set his coffee mug down and met his son's gaze. He had hoped that the questions would go away, that Malcolm's young mind would move on, but he knew better. This was a moment that would stay with him, one of the first lessons in the long, painful reality of how the world would sometimes see them. No, buddy. They're not going to come again, James reassured him, though deep down he knew that was only a half-truth. Incidents like this could happen again, and they might. It was an unfortunate reality of being a black man in a world that often misjudged him. But why did they come? Malcolm asked, his voice soft but laced with curiosity and worry. We didn't do anything wrong. James took a deep breath, considering his next words carefully. He wanted to protect Malcolm, to shield him from the harsher truths of the world, but he also knew he couldn't lie. His son deserved the truth, as much as he could understand it at his age. You're right. We didn't do anything wrong, James said, his voice calm but firm. Sometimes people make mistakes, and they think something bad is happening when it's not. That's what happened yesterday. Malcolm's brow furrowed, trying to process this. But why did that lady call the police? We were just playing. James felt a pang of frustration. How could he explain to his 6-year-old that some people would always see them as different, and that difference came with a set of assumptions? He didn't want to fill his son's heart with anger or fear, but he also couldn't ignore the reality of it. Some people don't understand, James said carefully. They get scared or worried when they don't know what's going on, and sometimes they make decisions that aren't fair. But it doesn't mean we did anything wrong, okay? Malcolm nodded slowly, though James could tell that his son was still processing. It broke his heart to see Malcolm grapple with something he was far too young to face. James wanted to offer more reassurance, but he knew that actions would speak louder than words. The best thing he could do was continue being the loving, present father Malcolm needed, despite the challenges they faced. James stood up from the table and placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. How about we do something fun today, he asked, trying to lighten the mood. Maybe go to the museum or the zoo. Malcolm's eyes lit up at the mention of the zoo, and for a moment the weight of the previous day seemed to lift. The zoo. Can we see the lions? James smiled. You got it. We'll see the lions. As Malcolm hurried to finish his breakfast, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. James wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief moment, his stomach tightened with unease. He walked over to the door, glancing through the peephole, and was surprised to see Amelia standing on his porch, her hands nervously clutching her purse. James's first instinct was to ignore her, to avoid any more confrontation. He didn't want to have this conversation, didn't feel like offering forgiveness or listening to whatever excuse she might have for her actions. But something made him open the door anyway, if only to bring closure to the situation. Amelia looked up at him with a mixture of guilt and hesitation, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. Dr. Harris, she began, her voice shaky. I'm sorry to bother you. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now. James didn't respond immediately, his face unreadable. He stepped aside, silently inviting her in, though he wasn't sure why he was letting her into his home. Amelia hesitated for a moment, then walked in, her step small and unsure. She looked around, taking in the warmth of his home, the family photos on the wall, the artwork Malcolm had proudly drawn and displayed on the fridge. I came to apologize, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, for what happened at the park. I was wrong, and I need you to know that I realize that now. James crossed his arms, his posture still guarded. You called the police on me because I was playing with my son. What exactly do you think an apology is going to fix? His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. Amelia flinched slightly, her eyes dropping to the floor. I don't know if an apology can fix it, she admitted, but I couldn't just sit with the guilt. I made assumptions, horrible, unfair assumptions. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was. James studied her for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had heard apologies like this before, well-meaning but hollow, words that people used to soothe their own guilt without really understanding the harm they had caused. Part of him wanted to tell her to leave, to save her apology for someone else. But another part of him, the part that had always believed in giving people a chance to learn and grow, wanted to hear her out. Do you? He asked quietly. Do you really understand what you did?" Amelia met his gaze, her eyes full of remorse. "I don't think I fully understood yesterday," she confessed. "But I've been thinking about it all night. I made assumptions about you because of how you look. I thought I was protecting that little boy, but I didn't stop to think that you were his father. I didn't stop to think at all." There it was, the admission James had been waiting for. She had finally said it out loud. She had called the police because she couldn't see past his skin color. Because in her mind, the image of a black man with a white or biracial child didn't fit her version of the world. It was a harsh truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. James let out a slow breath, feeling some of his anger begin to ebb away. "You made a decision based on fear," he said. "You didn't see me, you saw what you wanted to see, a threat." Amelia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know that now. And I hate that I did that. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I don't expect you to give that to me. But I needed to come here and own up to what I did. I need to do better. I will do better." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. James didn't know if he was ready to forgive her, but he could see that she was genuinely trying to understand. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. "I appreciate you coming here," James said finally, his tone softening just a little. "But words aren't enough. If you really want to change, you need to do the work. You need to check your assumptions before they lead to actions that hurt people." Amelia nodded again, her tears threatening to spill over. "I will, I promise." James didn't offer her more than that. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he was willing to let her walk away with the lesson she needed to learn. "I think we're done here," he said gently, signaling that it was time for her to leave. Amelia understood and quietly thanked him before turning to walk out the door. As she left, James watched her go, wondering if people like her could truly change, or if this was just another momentary glimpse of regret. He turned back to Malcolm, who had been watching the exchange from the couch. "Who was that lady?" Daddy Malcolm asked, his curiosity piqued. James sighed, walking over to sit beside his son. "Just someone who needed to learn a lesson, buddy," he said. "Let's get ready for the zoo." It had been a few weeks since the incident at the park. Life had returned to its usual rhythm for James and Malcolm. School pickups, playdates, and trips to the grocery store filled their days, while James' work at the hospital consumed his evenings. But despite the semblance of normalcy, James couldn't shake the lingering heaviness from what had happened. The confrontation with Amelia, the police presence, it had left an invisible mark on him, and to some extent on Malcolm as well. Today was different, though. Today, James had to perform one of the most complex surgeries of his career. He thrived in these high-pressure situations where his skills as a surgeon were tested, and the outcome could mean life or death. His patient was a 45-year-old woman with a complicated heart condition that required delicate, precise hands. James had spent the past week preparing mentally and physically, reviewing every detail of the procedure with his surgical team. As he scrubbed in, James found his usual focus returning. The cool scent of antiseptic filled the air, and the steady hum of the hospital outside the doors faded away. Here, in this sterile, controlled environment, James was in command. The outside world, with its judgments and biases, didn't exist. Here it was just him, his team, and the patient's life in his hands. But as he glanced at the surgery board before entering the operating room, his heart skipped a beat. Amelia Pearson. The name was written in clear, bold letters, confirming what he had feared when he first saw the name on the patient roster earlier that week. This was the same woman from the park, the woman who had called the police on him, the woman who had stood on his porch with her apology hanging in the air. James felt his chest tighten, his hand frozen in mid-scrub. Of all the patients in the city, why her? His mind raced. Could he do this? Could he operate on the woman who had humiliated him, who had made him question his place in the world as a father and a professional? His instinct was to step back, to let one of his colleagues take over the case. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. This was his patient, and walking away wasn't an option. As a surgeon, he had taken an oath. It wasn't about who the person on the table was or what they had done outside these walls. It was about saving lives, and that's what he had trained for all these years. He took a deep breath, shaking off the personal feelings that threatened to cloud his judgment. "You're a professional," he whispered to himself. "Do your job." He pushed through the door and into the operating room, where his team was already waiting. The patient prepped on the table. The lights were bright, and the familiar beeps of the heart monitor filled the room. Amelia lay unconscious under anesthesia, completely unaware that the man about to operate on her heart was the same one she had wronged just weeks ago. James looked down at her, his hands steady as they hovered over the instruments. It was surreal, knowing the woman beneath the surgical drapes had, in a different setting, seen him as something to fear. But here in this room there was no room for fear or prejudice, only precision, skill, and focus. "Scalpel," James said, his voice calm and controlled. The nurse placed the instrument in his hand, and just like that, the surgery began. Meanwhile, outside the operating room, Amelia's family waited anxiously in the waiting area. Her husband, Tom, paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back, worry etched on his face. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Amelia's condition had worsened over the past few weeks, and this surgery was her only hope of recovery. The irony that the man responsible for her life was the same man she had judged so harshly wasn't lost on him. He sat down beside their daughter, Lily, a quiet 17-year-old who looked as nervous as he felt. "Do you think she'll be okay?" she asked softly, her eyes wide with fear. Tom placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. "She's in the best hands," he said, though his mind couldn't help but wander back to what Amelia had told him about the park incident. He had seen the shame in her eyes when she recounted the story, the regret that had weighed heavily on her since that day. Tom didn't know Dr. Harris personally, but from everything he'd heard, the man was a brilliant surgeon, respected in the field. The idea that someone like Dr. Harris had been subjected to such unfair treatment by his own wife made Tom uncomfortable, to say the least. He had always considered himself progressive, someone who believed in equality and fairness, but Amelia's actions had forced him to confront the quiet prejudices that lurked within his own household. He glanced at the double doors of the operating room, silently praying that the man they had wronged would find it in himself to save Amelia's life. Back in the operating room, James moved with practiced precision, his hands steady as he worked to repair the damage to Amelia's heart. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but there was a quiet confidence in the way James led the team, guiding each step of the procedure with calm authority. As the surgery neared its most critical point, James's mind was laser-focused. He could feel the weight of what was happening, not just on a professional level, but on a deeply personal one. Every stitch, every movement was a reminder of his ability to rise above the situation, to be better than the assumptions that had been made about him. The hours stretched on, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, James finished the final steps of the procedure. He stepped back, the tension in his body releasing as the heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. The surgery had been a success. "Good work, everyone," he said, his voice a little softer now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. The team began the process of closing up and preparing Amelia for recovery. James stayed for a few more minutes, watching as she was wheeled out of the room and into the recovery ward. He felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The hardest part was over, at least medically. But there was another part of this story that wasn't over. He knew that when Amelia woke up, she would find out that he had been the one to save her life. And that knowledge would change something, maybe not for her immediately, but for him. In a way, it felt like a victory, though not the kind he had ever asked for. As James peeled off his gloves and washed his hands, he thought about the journey he had been on since that day in the park. There was still anger in him, but there was also a deep sense of pride. He had been tested not just as a surgeon, but as a person, and he had come through it with his integrity intact. Now all that was left was to see what Amelia would do with the second chance she had been given. The recovery room was quiet, the only sound being the soft beep of the heart monitor. Amelia slowly began to stir, her eyelids fluttering open as she regained consciousness. The room was dimly lit, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. She blinked, trying to make sense of where she was, her body feeling heavy and weak from the anesthesia. The events leading up to the surgery were still a blur, but as the fog in her mind began to clear, she remembered the fear she had felt when her doctor explained how serious her condition had become. She had needed the surgery, and she had known that without it, she might not make it. As Amelia's eyes adjusted to the light, she became aware of someone standing at the foot of her bed. Her vision focused, and her heart skipped a beat when she recognized him, Dr. James Harris. The man from the park. The man she had called the police on. and now the man who had saved her life. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. James stood there, dressed in his hospital scrubs, his expression calm but unreadable. He met her gaze, and she could see the weight of everything that had passed between them in his eyes. There was no anger there, no gloating, just a quiet professionalism that made her feel even smaller. James cleared his throat before speaking, his tone measured and steady. "Mrs. Pearson, the surgery was successful. You're going to make a full recovery." Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out at first. She felt a rush of emotions: gratitude, shame, guilt. How could she thank the man she had wronged so deeply? How could she apologize when the very fact that she was alive was because of him? I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, James held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "There's no need to say anything right now," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I was just doing my job." Amelia swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. She felt the weight of her actions bearing down on her, the enormity of what had happened between them. She had called the police on this man, had viewed him as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. And now here he was, the person who had saved her life, showing her a level of grace and professionalism that she hadn't shown him that day in the park. "I'm so sorry," Amelia said, her voice trembling, "for everything, for what I did, for how I treated you. I didn't know. I didn't understand." James watched her, his expression still calm but slightly softer now. He had heard this kind of apology before, and while he appreciated her sincerity, he knew that real change wouldn't come from words alone. It would come from actions, consistent, meaningful actions over time. "I understand," he said simply. "But what matters now is what you do with that understanding." Amelia's tears flowed freely now. She nodded, knowing he was right. There was no quick fix for what had happened. She had made a terrible mistake, one rooted in her own biases and fears, and now she had to live with the consequences. But she also knew that she had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at being a better person. "I promise," she whispered, "I'll do better." James nodded, though he remained cautious. He had heard promises like this before, and while he didn't doubt her sincerity in the moment, he knew that only time would tell if she truly meant it. "There's a lot of work to be done," James said, his voice steady but kind. "Not just for you, but for all of us. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Amelia wiped at her tears, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had learned. She was grateful beyond words for what James had done for her, but she also knew that she couldn't undo the harm she had caused. All she could do now was try to be better, try to make amends in whatever way she could. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. James nodded one last time. "Get some rest, Mrs. Pearson," he said, his tone professional once more. "You'll need your strength for the recovery ahead." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Amelia to reflect on everything that had happened. She lay there in silence, her mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. The gratitude she felt for being alive was tempered by the deep regret she carried for her actions. But as she drifted back into sleep, she made a vow to herself, a vow to confront her own biases, to educate herself, and to do everything in her power to be the kind of person who didn't act on fear and prejudice. A few days later, James sat in his office at the hospital, reviewing patient files for the week. The incident with Amelia still lingered in his mind, but life had moved on, as it always did. He had surgeries to perform, patients to care for, and a son to raise. Malcolm had bounced back quickly from the confusion at the park, his childhood innocence still intact, but James knew that as his son grew older, more difficult conversations would come. He would have to teach Malcolm the same lessons his own father had taught him, that being a black man in this world came with certain challenges, certain realities that couldn't be ignored. As James finished his notes, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Dr. Emily Watkins, his colleague and close friend, standing in the doorway with a warm smile. "Hey," she said, stepping into the room. "I just wanted to check in. I heard about the surgery with Mrs. Pearson." James smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah, it was a tough one, but it went well." Emily sat down across from him, studying his face. "And how are you? I know that must have been hard." James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "It was strange," he admitted, "but I'm okay. I did my job, and she's alive. That's what matters." Emily nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. You're a better person than most, James. Not everyone would have handled it with as much grace as you did. James shrugged, though he appreciated the compliment. I don't know if it's about being better, he said. I just knew I couldn't let my personal feelings get in the way of the work. It's not about her, it's about doing what's right. Emily smiled. Still, you handled it well. You always do. There was a brief moment of silence as they both reflected on the weight of the conversation. James appreciated Emily's support. She had been one of the few people who truly understood the challenges he faced as a black man in a predominantly white profession. So what's next? Emily asked, changing the subject slightly. You've got a full week of surgeries lined up. James nodded, glancing at the stack of patient files on his desk. Yep, back to the grind. As they talked, James couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. The events at the park, the surgery with Amelia, it had all tested him in ways he hadn't expected. But in the end, he had stayed true to himself, true to his values. He had shown Malcolm what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity, to rise above the prejudice and the fear. And in doing so, James knew he was not only making a difference in the operating room, but in the world around him as well.